Once again, we welcome you all to the Working Class Movement Library's Invisible Histories talks, where today we're happy to have as our speaker Matthew Kidd, whose topic is the renewal of radicalism, politics, identity and ideology in England, 1867 to 1924. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we'd like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there is a donate button on our website. Okay, Matt, thanks very much, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll get the screen shared first to make sure that everything works properly, if that's okay. Okay. Can I just check that? Oh, hold on. Can you all see that, basically? Can you see my screen, Lynette?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so it's got the picture. Okay, that's great. That's good to know.
Great.
Okay, so firstly, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk about my book, which has been about 8 years in the making, which was finally published in July last year, to little fanfare, thanks to the lockdown. Now, today I'm going to give you an overview of some of the book's main themes, what I consider to be its major contributions to our understanding of the topics that it deals with, that I'm going to elaborate over the course of the next 35 minutes or so. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to dip into one of the case studies on which the book is based, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, basically. Now, the short title of the book, and I apologize, I've realized when everyone says it out loud that it's quite a long title, but the short title is The Renewal of Radicalism, the meaning of which will become clear, I hope, over the next 35 minutes or so. The book, as you can see, covers a 50-year period between 1867 and 1924. I'm sure many of you are fully aware of the significance of those dates, but for those who aren't, 1867 represents the year in which the Second Reform Act became law, and when a substantial portion of the male working class received the vote for the first time. 1924 was the year in which Labour formed its first government. So there is significance to these dates. Today, due to time constraints, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the period 1867 through to about 1900. So we go right up to the foundation of the Labour Party. Now, the main aim of my book, and this is quite a long sentence, which I'll deconstruct. The main aim of the book is to use 5 local case studies, Bristol, Leicester, Lincoln, Norwich, Northampton, to map the trajectory of Labour politics and ideology from their origins in the radical traditions of the mid to late Victorian period through to the emergence of the Labour Party as a major force in the 1920s. Now, as I said, there's a lot to take apart in that sentence, and it raises, I think, a lot of questions of both a historical and academic nature, but also questions that have some contemporary relevance, I think. So just to summarize what those are, don't know what happened there. You still see my screen, okay?
Yes, it's gone to the gallery view type thing. So yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, that, can you see that? Historical questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that anyone who's interested in modern history will be aware of that this book must deal with is, I suppose, questions like what traditions did Labour emerge from? What were the organisational precursors to the Labour Party? How similar and how different were these organisations with the Labour Party? And what was new, what was novel about the Labour Party? In terms of questions around identity, the book looks at things like race, gender, class, that kind of thing. I look very much at how local activists understood themselves and how they defined themselves and their place in the social order. If, for example, they defined themselves as working class, what did that actually mean? Who did they think was included in this working class, and who was excluded, and how did that change over time? The book also quite heavily deals with questions of an ideological nature. It really tries to look at the frameworks of ideologies like liberalism, socialism, radicalism, and what I call Laborism, or what a lot of historians have called Laborism, and tries to identify the boundaries and the overlaps between these different ideologies. Now, I'd hope you'd agree that some of those questions have contemporary relevance, especially when we consider some of the factional struggles going on within the Labour Party today, and which have been going on for years, if not decades. especially when we think about things like the rise and fall of Corbyn and some of the claims as to the intention, the origins of the Labour Party, what it's about, what it should be. And I think a lot of people are asking that, not just in the Labour Party, probably outside. What is the Labour Party for? Who is it for? And these are some of the questions that my book implicitly probably deals with rather than explicitly. This is, after all, a history book, but it definitely gives you some food for thought, I think, on those questions. Now, to some extent, interestingly, those debates that are going on within the Labour Party at the moment mirror some of the academic debates about the early history of the Labour Party, debates that I'm far more comfortable engaging with rather than the contemporary questions. And I do need to give you a slight overview of these. I'm sure some of you are aware, but it won't really make sense what my book is trying to do unless I give you the context of how it fits into that historiography. So to summarize, and you don't need to read everything on here, I will try and summarize it, but the traditional account suggested that major political developments, including the rise of a supposedly working class Labour Party and the subsequent decline of a cross-class Liberal Party, were the product of deeper changes, mainly economic changes. In this view, social and economic developments in the final decades of the 19th century forced radicals to renounce their loyalty to a cross-class Liberal Party and to embrace some alternative frameworks for understanding the world around them. In short, during this period, we're talking roughly the late 19th century into the early 20th century, workers' political activity increasingly came to revolve around the question of class, and the evolution of a class-based Labour Party from a trade union pressure group party of government in the 1920s symbolised the decline of populist politics and the rise of class politics. Now, what this traditional three-stage account of British history for, this is the view of revisionist historians, was the survival of older ways of thinking about politics and society. So over the last 30 years or so, this traditional view has come under attack from a revisionist counter-argument, and the scholars that have put forward what has been called the continuity thesis. Rather than emphasising economic change and the rise of a class politics, scholars in this tradition have drawn attention to the endurance of older populist attitudes and identities. Anyone familiar with the work of people like Eugenio Biagini and Alistair Reid, but also Patrick Joyce, will know that they very much emphasised the importance of concepts of the people rather than the working class. This large, broad group of the people supposedly included artisans, small tradesmen, organised workers, and even in some places, gentlemen, rather than this movement of a single class. And for Patrick Joyce, radicals generally avoided an exclusivist language of class in favour of phrases and terms that emphasised reconciliation and inclusiveness and things like that. So in this view, Victorian radicalism was a populist rather than a class-based movement. And with the evolution of this radicalism into the Labour and Liberal parties in the early 20th century, popular radicalism was able to survive and continue to shape the tone of progressive politics in Britain until at least 1914. So what does my book say about these questions? Well, it challenges both traditional and revisionist accounts by proposing an alternative narrative of continuity that doesn't do away with class as a tool of historical analysis. Some might say that I'm having my cake and eating it, which someone said, but I suppose I am in some respects. Now, in short, the book very much focused on activists rather than high-level thinkers or politicians. Labour activists remain committed to the practices, the assumptions, and the core ideological beliefs of their radical predecessors, even as they were forming new organisations at a local level. But the crucial point here is that I argue that the precursors of the Labour Party in these towns and cities was a working class radical tradition rather than a populist radical tradition. Now, this distinction isn't merely semantic. I argue that during the Victorian period, as many of us know, radicals were named for their advocacy of radical reform of the political system, and they formed lively political subcultures across Britain. Armed with a distinctive language and a unique understanding of concepts such as democracy, liberty, equality, and rights, working class radicals either formed uneasy alliances with mainstream liberals, or in some places, such as Bristol, they actually worked against them. Now, the differences between working class radicalism and popular radicalism reveals itself in several ways, not least in the way activists spoke about the social and political order and the way they used certain terms, phrases, and concepts, which I'm going to give you some examples of shortly. Very generally, we can see that liberals and populist radicals tended to see the basic division of society as between the idle and the industrious, between the masses and the classes, these very broad, ill-defined categories. Whereas I argue that working class radicals tended to frame their understandings of society in a more exclusivist language of class. They also articulated a class-inflected, I suppose we could say, version of radical ideology that often led them into conflict with liberals and other radicals. Now, political scientists have generally not seen radicalism as a distinct ideology. Perhaps they see it as a kind of advanced form of liberalism. But I suggest that we can actually construct this framework of what radicalism was as an ideology, and therefore we can identify it as something different from liberalism. And I go into quite a lot of detail in the book about that. So, as I say, in the book, I argue that this class-based radical tradition left an indelible political labour movement. So from the 1880s onwards, members of this tradition played a pivotal role in building up local labour parties at a local level in Bristol and in lots of places across the country, that over the following 4 decades would coalesce into the National Labour Party. Like their predecessors, these local labour parties were never really subsumed within broad populist coalitions, even if they formed uneasy alliances with local liberal associations. They were always assertive political forces in their own right, whose members fought doggedly to achieve their self-defined goals by forming pragmatic alliances. So I very much focus on this transition away from working class radicalism, but I argue that it didn't necessarily represent a substantive change in the way these activists thought about the world around them. Much like working class radicals before them, labourists exhibited a strong sense of class identity, whilst rejecting often the politics of class conflict, which is a nuanced way of looking at class at the time. For labourists, the experience of political and social exclusion helped to nurture an inverted sense of class pride. They believed, for example, that only working men could truly understand the experiences and wants of working men, which justified their demand for direct labour representation. But this was also a very restrictive conception of the working class that often served to reinforce boundaries between those who belonged to this group and those who supposedly didn't. I'm thinking very much of women workers, rural workers, the unemployed, foreign workers, that kind of thing. So there were some subtle and perhaps not very subtle ways of marking the boundaries between these. So while male labourists at these times may have seen their rural brethren or women workers as worthy of support and giving sympathy to, they didn't always, they often saw them, as threats to the hard-won rights of the wages of better organised and better paid urban male workers. And I argue actually throughout the book that throughout the whole period that I'm looking at, these long-held assumptions about gender, race, and place, work, nationality, these kind of things were hard to shake off, even in the face of political and economic change. And then finally, in terms of ideological continuity, I argue that Labourism, which became the dominant ideology in these local labour parties, was in effect working class radicalism in a new guise. Essentially, this evolution represented a change in the way activists articulated their understanding of the social order and a minor adjustment in the conceptual framework of their ideologies. For anyone that knows the history of this period, one of the major influences on this evolution was the emergence of collectivism as a hotly debated topic in the late 19th century. Now, during that period in the 1880s, 1890s, many radicals began to promote what G.D.H. Cole called an advanced radicalism with certain marked collectivist tendencies. As a result, radicals began to include a much wider range of collectivist demands in their programs, including the municipal employment of the unemployed and the establishment of a state system of pensions. Now, this isn't to suggest that there are no differences whatsoever between the radicalism of the 19th century and the Labourism of the early 20th century. It's very clear, for example, that Labourists were much more persistent in their efforts to achieve direct labour representation. But an argument I put forward in the book is that the inclusion of new demands into political programs didn't necessarily confirm that a deep shift in thinking had taken place. Instead, it may have signified a change in the way they interpreted certain concepts, concepts such as rights and democracy, liberty, equality, that had long informed political agendas. The emergence of the state as an important concept in their worldview served to add a collectivist gloss to these political programs. Just to give you an example, Labourist understanding of democracy came to be associated not only with the extension of the franchise, but also with the need for the democratic or state ownership and control of certain industries. Labourists expanded the old radical notion of rights, not only to include the right of trade unionists to resist the tyrannical employment practices of their employers, but also the right to work, which they believed that the state should guarantee by providing employment to those temporarily out of work. So in this sense, Labourists remained attached to the concepts of radicalism, whilst also broadening the meaning of those concepts. So what are my arguments based on? Well, I carried out 5 local case studies, as I said at the top of the talk, that produced similar political traditions despite their geographical segregation, which hopefully you can see on this map here. So on any conventional map, this region stretches from Bristol in the southwest via Leicester, Northampton, Lincoln, some other smaller towns throughout the East Midlands, right over to Norwich in East Anglia. Now, all of these constituencies were of vital electoral importance to both the Liberal and subsequently the Labour parties during the period covered in the book. But they've been relatively neglected actually by previous scholars to some extent, particularly places like Lincoln. Indeed, I hope that in some ways this book offers a much needed corrective to a historiography that has so long focused on places like London, West Midlands, and I hate to say it, Lancashire. Now, while there were important differences between these towns and cities in terms of social structure, population size, that kind of thing, Labour politics in all of these areas grew out of local working class radical traditions. Socialists, I can hear some of you say, yes, they did work in these local Labour parties, but I think it's always important to note that they did form a minority, an active and vocal minority, but a minority within them. I think it should also be noted that these local Labour parties weren't just liberal parties in a new, updated form. They emerged from a complex web of working class movements that had long struggled outside and sometimes against mainstream liberalism. So to show you how this evolution occurred and how Labour politics and ideology emerged out of the working class radical tradition, I'm going to just focus on Leicester, just one example. It's not a very fashionable choice, but that's one of the reasons I'm going to talk about it. Now, during the Victorian era, commentators often referred to some of these places in the southwest, East Midlands and East Anglia as strongholds of political, and if you go right back into the Civil War period, of religious radicalism as well. Now, Leicester's reputation as a bastion of Chartism, of religious dissent and of secularism convinced one member of the Leicester Labour Party in the early 20th century that his home city had an atmosphere that tended towards liberty. That's how he described it. Now, in the 1860s and 70s, radicals in Leicester valued their political independence or semi-independence from the Liberal Party. A city that had become the important centre of the hosiery and footwear trades, working men in these industries became the backbone of the city's burgeoning secularist movement and helped to establish the Leicester Democratic, later renamed the Leicester Republican Association in 1871. And this organisation became an important centre of gravity for those described by one local newspaper as the very advanced liberals of Leicester, a group that campaigned, you need to remember this is the 1870s, a group that campaigned for universal suffrage, not just manhood suffrage, for secular education, for direct labour representation, and for the formation of trade unions for both men and women. The Democratic Association had an identifiable working class image, and it was intended as, and this is a quote, an extensive scheme of organisation on the part of the working classes of Leicester. Now, radicals in Leicester were relatively successful at achieving their objectives, especially when you compare it to places like Bristol. Even before the Reform Act of 1867, they'd managed to secure the election to Parliament of Peter A. Taylor, pictured here, a member of the Courtauld textile family whose views on secularism, republicanism, and Italian unification made him a very popular figure for a time in radical circles. They were also successful in convincing leaders of the Leicester Liberal Association to support their demand for Labour representation at a local level. Still, while radicals and liberals worked together during these election contests, it wasn't an entirely harmonious relationship. At radical meetings, it wasn't uncommon for speakers to express their dissatisfaction with Liberal MPs and with Liberal governments. Not even Gladstone, the People's William, was immune from criticism. At the first meeting of the Democratic Association in 1871, held in the aptly named Gladstone Hall, a founding member hoped for a time when England would have a Prime Minister, Gladstone was the Prime Minister at the time, quote, who would not only look after the interests of the middle and upper class, but of those of the working class. Now, this insistence on using a language of class when discussing political matters, and a tendency to prioritise the needs of the working classes over those of other sections of the community, distinguished radicals in Leicester from their allies. So this radical liberal alliance in Leicester, though successful at containing the electoral challenge of the Conservatives, was, I argue, a strategic partnership of two distinct groupings whose members had different priorities and often contrasting interests. Now, there were also ideological, quite subtle, but also important ideological differences between radicals and liberals in Leicester. We can see this clearly at a meeting that was organised in the city in 1878, when liberals and radicals from Leicester agreed that the principles of liberalism included the struggle for civil and religious liberty, the disestablishment of the Church of England, the maintenance of free trade, things like that. So far, so good. But for Daniel Merrick, who's pictured here, he was one of the outstanding trade unionists in Leicester at this time. He thought this list of principles was incomplete. He told those present, after some liberal speakers had spoken, he got up on the stage and he told those present that there were great differences of opinion among liberals as to the chief questions that were soon to be settled by Parliament. Now, he felt that previous speakers had neglected to mention certain things. For example, he believed that the Liberal Party should support the principle of direct Labour representation, so that the House of Commons would represent the different classes of society, something, again, that liberals at the meeting had failed to mention. He also demanded that MPs be paid for their services to ensure that all classes had a fair and equal chance of being represented. Again, something that liberals at the meeting had refused to mention. Now, I think, and I argue in the book, that seeing concepts such as democracy is more important in the conceptual framework of radicalism, particularly when you compare it to the conceptual framework of liberalism, makes it easier for us to understand these differences and to understand why Merrick's fellow speakers failed to mention these demands, while he felt that they should take prior importance. Working class radicals also, like Merrick, often presented these supposedly universalist demands, such as the extension of the franchise or opposition to the monarchy, in a clear language of class. For instance, Citizen Payne, as he styled himself, who was a member of the Leicester Democratic Association at the time, complained of the needless grants to royalty, something on which perhaps Peter Taylor, the MP, would have agreed with. But when he was justifying why he thought these grants were needless, he made it clear that his opposition to this kind of oppression, as he called it, stemmed from his direct experiences as a working man and his belief that the diversion of resources to the monarchy, quote, pressed heavily on the hard earnings of my class. So this isn't to say that liberals and radicals couldn't find common ground on issues. They often voted the same way at election time, and sometimes they worked together in campaigns, particularly in Leicester on the Bradlaugh campaigns of the 1880s. But by working together in campaigns and even uniting around a certain election candidate doesn't necessarily mean that they were part of the same identical political and intellectual tradition. And this becomes important if we try to understand the relationship between liberals and Labour in the early 20th century, which I'm now going to move on to, this emergence of Labour politics and how it linked with this older radical tradition. So a series of developments in the final years of the 19th century forced working class radicals in Leicester and across the United Kingdom to reflect on the relevance of their political and ideological doctrines. I'm talking about things like the revival of interest in socialism in the 1880s, the new unionist strike wave of the same period in the 1890s, growing interest in poverty generated by surveys and investigations, and also a growing sense that the state could be used to alleviate certain social ills. Also the emergence of local Labour parties. at a local level. Now, in some places such as Leicester, the emergence of a self-defined, self-described Labour politics coincided with the establishment of a local Labour Party of a kind. 2 years before the outbreak of new unionism in 1889, trade union leaders formed a Labour association with the primary intention of electing working men to the city council. The Labour Association's early leaders sought to work in harmony with the Leicester Liberal Association and often praised the city's Liberal MPs for voting with the Labour Party in the House of Commons. Now, in fact, local support for the idea of a Liberal-Labour alliances was confirmed at a double parliamentary by-election in 1894, when Henry Broadhurst, oh, it's gone again, I don't know what happened here, hold on. Henry Broadhurst, initially recommended by the Leicester Trades Council, but then adopted by the Liberal Association, headed the poll, as you can see here, with nearly 34% of the vote. Now, the independent Labour Party candidate, who also received the support of the Trades Council, achieved an impressive almost 16% of the vote, despite only campaigning for 4 days. And I think this election result shows some kind of support for a Lib-Lab alliance. And that Lib-Lab alliance, if any of you are aware of James Ramsay MacDonald's early career, he became MP for Leicester in a kind of Lib-Lab alliance. That support for that alliance remained strong in Leicester right up to the First World War. I don't have time to look at the complex nature of that relationship today, but it's definitely worth reading, perhaps in my book. Still, while many Labour activists were happy to work with the Liberal Party to achieve their objectives, as you can see here from this by-election result, this still didn't mean that Labourists were liberals in an ideological sense. Sometimes there's been a tendency to look at political organisation, political alliances, and assume there's some kind of identity, interest. I'm sorry, this has gone again. Hold on. There's a similarity in an ideological sense as well. But I argue that the socialist demands that were put forward by leaders of the new unions in the 1890s and their relative success in achieving their short-term aims helped to bring formally impractical ideas such as nationalisation of entire industries or the enactment of an 8-hour day across an entire industry, brought those into the realm of practical politics. Consequently, Labour activist solutions to a range of social and economic problems became increasingly collectivist in tone, and by the end of the 1890s, most Labourists had come to favour a parliamentary enforced 8-hour day, a state-based system of old age pensions, public work schemes for the unemployed, and so on. Now, this was an important development intellectually and also the ramifications that had in the political world. But rather than embracing an entirely new conceptual framework or even embracing socialism, I argue that most of the working class radicals who became active in the Labour movement in this period continued to give an expression to an ideology that differed in several ways and important respects from both liberalism and also from various forms of socialism. I argue that Labourism retained the core conceptual components of working class radicalism, whilst it placed a greater emphasis on the importance of the state as a means through which to achieve their old objectives. Yes, this did add a collectivist tone to their programmes, but at the same time, Labourists were always keen to downplay the socialist connotations of their demands, tending to instead place an emphasis on the practicality and the moderation of their demands. For many, the state wasn't envisaged as the future owner and controller of the entire means of production and exchange, but simply as an effective instrument that could be used in some areas and at some time to improve the lives and conditions of the workers, often within the framework of existing society. I've got a nice picture here I'll explain in a minute. Now, Labourists sometimes felt it was necessary to make this distinction between what they thought about collectivism and what some of these socialist organisations at the time thought. Now, at the 1894 conference of the Boot and Shoe Operatives Union, which was very strong in Leicester, and actually the base of the union was in Leicester at this time, William Inskip, who is pictured here, who was the General Secretary of the union, expressed his discomfort with some of his colleagues' views on collective ownership. Now, for Inskip, collective ownership meant confiscation, that was his word for it, and if introduced, it would inhibit the ability, thrift, and energy of the workmen. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, Inskip's views were challenged by socialist delegates who were members of the ILP and the Social Democratic Federation, who had come to form strong minorities in some of the branches of the union. But something that often isn't picked up in the history of the union and the history of the labour movement this time is that Inskip faced opposition from labourists who sought to downplay the idealistic undertones of this demand for collective ownership. As one delegate explained, many trade unionists favoured the principle of collective ownership of certain industries simply because it was a good example of a practical rather than ideal form of socialism. So whilst they were arguing against socialists, saying that you're very idealistic, you've got this millenarian sense of socialism, they were also arguing against people like Inskip, who was probably a liberal in thought, who opposed any movement towards a more collectivist future. Now, what Inskip's doing here, you might be wondering, is he is swallowing all of the demands of his union. So I don't know if you can see there on the swords that he's putting down his throat, there's things like 8-hour day, graduated income tax, payment of members. So he's willing to swallow all these swords. The one which he won't swallow is the nationalisation of land and the means of production. And he actually stood down as the union's chosen election candidate because he refused to stand on the platform with that demand. And these are really good resources if you're interested in reading these debates. Really helps to, I think, define some of the different intellectual currents within the labour movement at the time. Now, what does this all mean and why is all this important? I'm just going to wrap it up now so we can move on to the question and answer session. Well, I think that if the origins of Labourism and the origins of the Labour Party in these areas can be traced to this class-conscious radical tradition that differed in several respects from both liberalism and socialism, then I think it becomes easier for us to understand the nature of the Labour Party in the Edwardian period right up through to the First World War. It helps us to understand the at times complex and tense relationship between Liberal and Labour politics during that period. It helps us to account for the rise of a class-based and class-orientated Labour Party without having to do away with any emphasis on continuity. And there it goes again. Finally, there's just 2 more points before my computer goes. There we go. Although it embraces the idea that there were strong continuities, it allows us to retain class as a concept, a useful concept, in understanding the political realignment in which Labour replaced the Liberals. And finally, it allows us to acknowledge these continuities in politics and identity and ideology that I think were clearly there, without having to emphasise the formation of a class-based Labour Party and seeing that as a sharp juncture, I think, in British politics. And I'm sure, again, I'm not as confident talking about current developments in the Labour Party, but I'm sure you'll see and maybe see some of the implicit conclusions that can be drawn from some of these things when we think about what the Labour Party is for and who it is for, essentially. But I think that's enough time now. Yeah, 35 minutes on the dot. So yeah, I'm happy to hand over to any questions or comments you have.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. We'll jump back to so we can see people.
Stop share.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Right, great. So folks, if you've got questions, you want to stick them in the chat, you're welcome to do that, but you're also welcome just to wave at me if that's easier for you, and I'll keep an eye out for you. So I hope you've been thinking, plenty to ponder there. And I've flagged up the fact that we do have some interesting material about Leicester particularly. I'm interested in, I've only just recovered, I have to say, Matthew, from a map which showed Liverpool and Leeds, but not Manchester on it. But I'm very interested in how you chose the cities that you looked at. Bristol, we have quite a lot about, again, in the library. The Bristol Radical History group have created some fantastic pamphlets that we have and have really traced their city's radical history. But yeah, how did you choose the cities?
I was looking at Duncan Tanner's book, Political Change. This was at the beginning of my PhD, Duncan Tanner's Political Change in the Labour Party. And he really does divide the growth of the Labour Party up into geographical regions. These were the Bristol and Northampton, as again, they're geographically segregated, but they shared a lot in common. And I was really intrigued by the fact that, I mean, Bristol and Northampton are obviously very different in terms of size, in terms of one's a, has a lot of dockers, and Northampton is pretty much nowhere near the seaside, that kind of thing. Yet there were these interesting parallels in terms of the development and the political trajectory. They were all seen as radical liberal strongholds in the 19th century. They all went Labour in the early 1920s. And it was really a way of testing the extent to which social and economic factors influenced political factors. So that's why I picked these seemingly random places, because I wanted to see if there were any ways we could link up the social, economic, and political trajectories of these places. I'm from Northamptonshire, so that probably influenced the Northampton thing. Again, that was one of the areas, like you say, there's been a nice amount written on Bristol. I've seen somewhere in the chat people that Leicester's, some people like David Howe have mentioned Leicester. There was a really good book written on Leicester that goes up to 1906. But again, I don't think it's been done in the comprehensive way, and that I've done it in terms of going from 1867 right through to the 1920s for all of those towns. So I've definitely drawn on the work of previous historians, but linking it up and looking at it through a new lens, I suppose, is something that hopefully my book's quite original in, I think.
Yeah. And did you find interesting things in the archives of those cities? Did you go to the county record office or wherever to find material?
Yes, yeah. So it's heavily based on archival materials. I think some of the most interesting ones I came across, particularly when trying to identify what the nature of the ideology of these local activists and the nature of their identity, was even things like posters and songbooks. The Bristol Socialist Society, for example, which had many famous members, Ernest Bevin, Ramsay MacDonald, people like that. They had a songbook. They were very known for introducing music into their meetings. So even just looking at some of the songs they chose to include, and some of the new songs that they wrote and things like that, was a good way of identifying maybe some of the major themes and concepts and assumptions that they carried into their politics. So yeah, they were the most interesting archival resources that I used, definitely.
Gosh, yes. How many years did you spend on this research? It sounds extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, I started in 2012, my PhD, and I got my PhD in 2016, but my PhD was based only on Bristol and Northampton. And then when I converted it into a book, I had to go and do more case studies, so 3 more. So yeah, it took about 8 years in total. Local newspapers were probably the most useful resource. When I started, I was going down to Colindale, where you had to go and look at the physical newspapers. But by the end of my research, most of these newspapers had been digitized, so I could just sit in my nice warm home, traveling through all these newspapers. But yeah, it's been a long old time coming, but it's thoroughly enjoyable.
Well, that's good. You retained your enthusiasm throughout. That's that's come across. Yes, thank you. So Sue asks, I'm aware of how close Bristol is to the somewhat posher city of Bath. Did that influence the rise of socialism there, and does that apply to any of the other cities?
It's really interesting. When I was researching places like Bristol and places, it's hard not to look at where else they went, particularly the socialist activists, the most active in the 1890s. I'm thinking of the Clarion cycling vans and the vans that went out into the countryside. And there was definitely some examples of people going out into more rural areas, places like Bath and Taunton. No, not Taunton. It begins with T, another place down near Bristol. That's going to bug me now. But yeah, they did send people out into these areas. But my supervisors, when doing my PhD, kept saying you need to rein it in, because I would have just gone and gone and gone. So unfortunately, I can't tell you a great deal about Bath because I was told off for going down that path. And I would have had many more case studies if I could have done. But I think the one place where I have looked elsewhere is Northamptonshire, because of the nature of the boot and shoe industry in Northamptonshire, where they used to send out a lot of the tasks into local villages. So I look at unfashionable places like Wellingborough, Rushden, Kettering, places like that. But I didn't do it for Bristol because, for various reasons, it was a big city enough as it was. But yeah, so I can't really tell you much about Bath, I'm afraid.
Okay, don't worry, you can't cover everything. So somebody's asked whether we have that particular songbook at WCML. That's a good question. We do have a lot of them, and my colleague Jane has spent a lot of time cataloguing them in some detail. So we can certainly have a look, or have a look yourself on the online catalogue. We've got a fantastic collection of songbooks. So Tim says, were those in the labourist tradition that you identify aware of their being part of a working class tradition?
That's a good question. I'd argue yes, through the language that they used. I mean, there were many examples that I was going to give, and I'll give you an example from Leicester. There was a newspaper in Leicester called the Leicester Pioneer, which was formed in about 1895, eventually became the local paper of the Labour Party in Leicester. Ramsay MacDonald was heavily involved in it. And there were clear, in some of the letters that were sent, there were clear distinctions between socialism and laborism. And they might not have used the term laborism, it was sort of the trade union man, things like that. This idea that they didn't think too far ahead, they just wanted practical, meaningful reforms in the short term. But there were clear discussions around this, about, for example, class, and around, for example, whether we should allow well-meaning middle-class liberals to help out, and how much that should be. And the Leicester Pioneer was one of those that there were big discussions about whether they should accept money from well-meaning, wealthy people, whether it should be a workers-only thing that was funded by subscription. So there are far too many examples for me to mention where it was clear that there was unease around these alliances, even if they knew that tactically we had to work with other forces during election time. There was a clear unease, and there was a clear fear that people like MacDonald, for example, was far too comfortable working with liberals. And as many of you know, in the 1930s, you could almost see the germ of what he did in 1931, right back in Leicester in the early 1900s, where a lot of local activists saying, you know, it's all very well you forming an unofficial alliance with liberalism, as long as you remember that you are representing a party of trade unionists, that you're representing a party for us, and yes, we'll work with them for, I don't know, if we want to clip the wings of the House of Lords, but we're doing that for our own reasons. And I'd argue that feeling is very strong, and it comes across a lot in the archival materials.
Thank you. We've got help from Pete the T. He suggests is Trowbridge, or is it pronounced Trowbridge? Is that right?
It's not Trowbridge. It's really going to
bug me.
I'm going to have to get Google Maps up in there.
I was thinking Totnes, but I'm not sure.
No, it's not Totnes.
No, that's further down. Okay, so he points out that Bath and Trowbridge, however I'm pronouncing it, sorry folks in Trowbridge, both had strong Chartist traditions.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so question from Julian. How does your analysis of Labourism articulate with the histories of socialist parties, ILP, SDF, etc.?
That's a really good question. I think that I argue that there were, if we're thinking conceptually about ideologies, and I use the work of someone called Michael Frieden, who's written a lot about this, that ideologies are effectively collections of concepts. We can't just say liberalism is about liberty. It wasn't. It's about liberty and other things, and it was to do with how liberty and equality merged. That's how we define liberalism, and how these concepts might move around morphologically. It's quite theoretical, but I argue basically that in terms of the frameworks, I think socialism and laborism are different. That's not to say that there aren't overlaps in terms of concepts. I just think that these different frameworks led to different emphasis, and I think there are overlaps. I think there were what we might call laborists within the ILP, but I think it's clear that when you look at the programs of the ILP, when their number one demand or number two demand was the nationalisation of the entire, or collectivization of the means of production, that didn't make many labourists feel entirely comfortable. They might accept that things like the railways should be nationalised, the mines, or what they called natural monopolies should be nationalised. That didn't mean that that's a stepping stone towards a socialist society. They meant that nationalisation of the mines might lead to better wages for the miners. That's very different, I think, when you really look closely from what some of the, particularly ILPers, were arguing in the 1910s. Not all of them. There were some, as I say, that were much more perhaps practically minded than others. But even in the 1920s, when you look at some of the literature by ILP candidates, they're talking very much around building this new world, looking forward. And one of my chapters is about building that new social order. A lot of Labourists would have felt slightly uneasy, I think, about this idea of building an entirely new social order. It seemed too idealistic and too far-fetched. So actually, what I'm saying might seem quite subtle, but I think that the more and more you look at these, the way in which these discussions were taking place and the language that was used, I think it's clear that you can tease out some of these important distinctions. And I think that these distinctions, this is a bold claim, but I think these distinctions have existed within the Labour Party forever, to be honest. I think there's clear dividing lines between the extent to which you'll go and the way why you want some of these objectives, nationalisation, for example.
Thanks. Another question. Many thanks for a great talk, says Andrew. During your research, did you discover any activism or interest shown by agricultural workers towards radicalism? And if so, did they receive support from urban radicals?
I'm glad you asked that. It's one of my favourite topics. And again, I wanted to go much, because it's a very urban focused book. And I wish it wasn't, because yes, I think I'll mention particularly in the 1870s when Joseph Arch was building his agricultural labourers union, they got a lot of support from urban workers in these towns and cities. However, there was like a two-sided thing. They were happy for them to unionize. They saw it as a welcome development. Urban-based trade unionists in these places organized meetings, they raised money, they welcomed agricultural labourers onto the trades councils, that kind of thing. However, at the same time, they were arguing that agricultural labourers who were coming into the city, particularly in Bristol, who were migrating into the city, should be stopped and sent to Canada, and that emigration schemes were better for unemployed agricultural workers than welcoming them as members of the urban trade unions. So there was this odd twin focus, and I think that was the same for women workers. They wouldn't have opposed the trade unionization of women workers. However, I think their preference would have been that particularly married women didn't work. If we move right forward through to the First World War, again, they welcomed the unionization of women who entered the factories in the First World War. But a lot of the Labour 1918 election programme, if you look at local election programmes, were saying that women should go back to the home, so soldiers who came back would have other jobs. So there was always a dual emphasis and dual perception of these things, and it was the same for agricultural labourers. I think a big change came just before the First World War, when there was a kind of, as I'm sure the questioner is aware, there was a big move to unionise trade unionists again. There was some industrial conflict. I think even Lloyd George there was a big liberal land campaign, that kind of thing. There was a greater interest shown in agricultural labourers. And I would say then that's when some of the boundaries started to break down. But if anyone has read, I'm really bad with names, but there's a really good book called Labour in the Countryside, I think, that looks at the 1918 period onwards. You can still see that Labour was perceived as an urban party. There was slightly uncomfortable talking about rural issues. But yeah, there was definitely a significant development over the period of my book in attitudes.
Right, a question from Pete in the chat. After that, I'll take, and so there's a couple of people waving their hands at me, so I'll go to you after this. Did you find any examples of young Chartists re-emerging in later life in the Labour movement? Most seem to re-emerge as liberals.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't. I mean, I started in 1867. I'm trying to think. There weren't any activists that I focused on in the 1870s that had been Chartists. I think those that were, like you say, had become liberals, and I think that's really interesting. And there's been a lot of stuff around that. Biagini and people arguing that liberalism, the broad-based populist nature of liberalism in that, and Gladstonian liberalism particularly, could accommodate some of those old Chartists. That didn't mean that those 1870s radicals didn't look back to the Chartist era for inspiration. In many ways, they were saying that they were continuing that tradition or reviving that tradition. And many of their programs carried the the points of the charter that hadn't been accomplished, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the idea of payment of representatives, that kind of thing. But interestingly, you go right through, and even the early Labour Party and some of the Labour activists were harking back to that Chartist era, if not before. And something that I didn't have time to talk about today, and something I'm really interested in now that I've put the book behind me, is how the left, the English left, or British left, if you want to call it, is very much forward focusing, building a new world and things like that. But they do very much look backwards for inspiration, for guidance, but also for justification, I think. And there are numerous examples of that, even at a local level. I look very much at Northampton, where Charles Bradlaugh, if any of you are aware of the struggles of Bradlaugh in the 1880s, the first openly atheist MP. In the 1910s, the Social Democratic Party Federation, saying that if Bradlaugh were alive today, he'd be a socialist. So there's this very much this idea that if the Chartists were around today, they would be Labour, in the Labour Party, that kind of thing. So even though I didn't see any direct overlaps in terms of personnel, the influence was definitely there, and they wanted to claim that they were part of that heritage, and they were continuing that tradition.
Okay, thank you. Labour in the countryside, Herbert Morrison, 1950?
No, I think it was Claire. I think it was Claire something.
Okay, well, it's not one we have in the library, so we'll need to remedy that one.
I've just remembered, it's Claire
Griffiths. Yes, you got it at the same moment as Martin Wright in the chat. Well done.
Yeah, that's very, very good. If anyone's interested, yeah.
Ray, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It's given me a lot to think about. I don't know if other people feel that. Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you looked specifically at in your rise of radicalism, at the role of women. In the Working Class Movement Library have published a biography of Enid Stacy, who was very, very active. She grew out of, that's the wrong sort of phrase, I'm sorry. The Bristol, she grew up in Bristol, radical socialist movement. And the library republished, published a biography which had been sort of left on one side by Angela Tuckett. And in it, it's fascinating really what she did as a woman at the end of the 19th century. And I wondered if you'd thought of this, you know, these women who at the end of the 19th century did such amazing things, I think, you know, for their time. I mean, they would have been looked at as radical now, you know, and in a time when there was so much misogyny, they were just amazing.
No, you're absolutely right. And Enid Stacy was one of those that I definitely look at. And there were many other like her, people like Annie Besant and people like that. Particularly on one of the chapters where I look at the 1880s, where there was this revival of socialism.
Yes.
I traced some of the lectures. So people like Enid Stacy and Annie Besant were basically sent all over the country, and they were doing speeches, and they stand up and debate, have these really interesting debates with liberals, trying to say, you know, why is socialism the new gospel and liberalism? So yeah, I do look at a lot of those, but even right through into the 1920s, Margaret Bomfield, she was MP for Northampton, for example. So one of the case studies I do is looks at Northampton and sees Margaret Bomfield's campaign. She started campaigning there in 1920. There was a by-election. And again, not only do I look at it like you say, because of how amazing what they were doing and facing the prejudice at the time, but I also look at it as a way of seeing how attitudes to women changed, because there's been a lot of talk about the First World War was really revolutionary in changes of perceptions about women workers and stuff. But then when you look at some of the things that Margaret Bomfield had to face from her opponents and from voters, you realize that this change wasn't quite as transformative as some have argued. And actually, and even at a local level, even women joining Labour parties in 1919, 1920, and there were women's sections, they had to have a separate section and that kind of thing. And little interest was really shown by some of the male leaders towards it. And there was still a preference that, okay, it's very good that you're unionizing stuff, but we'd still prefer a man to be in this position, that position. And I'm probably exaggerating, it was more complex than that. But so, yeah, I would say that I do. Unfortunately, I didn't have time. I was going to talk to you about some of the trade unionists in Leicester who in the pre-First World War period actually created their own trade union. They left the men's boot and shoe workers union and formed an independent women's boot and shoe workers trade union. Because they were supposedly infected by the suffragette militancy, and they basically broke away from this union. I mean, they were actually the major part of the workforce in some sections of the hosiery and boot and shoe trade in Leicester, and yet they were treated as not being the dominant force at that time by some of the men trade unionists. So yeah, I hope that if you do get a chance to read the book, you'll hope that I have given enough attention to people like Enid Stacy and those people. But I'm just afraid I didn't mention them explicitly today.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Thanks, Ray. Okay, does anyone else want to wave at me to ask a question? Eleanor, you can unmute yourself.
Right, I'm fascinated particularly because I was born and bred in Bristol, and I think the thing that was different about Bristol was that actually the aristocracy were not important so much in the 19th century. It was the merchant venturers who were very much in control of Bristol rather than, so things. And funny enough, I would have mentioned Enid Stacy, who was a huge one, plus her, they were the aunts. She was the aunt of both Angela Tuckett, who went on to be in Swindon, and also Joan Tuckett, who was one of the founders of the Bristol Unity Theatre. So there was lots of radical stuff going on there. But really, yes, the Bristol, as I say, had a very early formed a trades council and all the rest of it. And I think that was because, that there wasn't the interruption of, a lot of aristocracy weren't around. There were merchant venturers took their place. And I think that changed the nature of Bristol.
That's a really interesting, like you say, Bristol Trades Council was very early, 1873, but they were very early in the van for the Labour representation. I mean, George Odker, some of you have heard of, in 1870, Bristol radicals tried to stand a trade union Labour candidate in the parliamentary election, and they couldn't get the money. But I think this is 1870. When were Burt and MacDonald were seen as the first working class MPs in 74, I think. So this is 4 years before that. Bristol almost ran a trade unionist as a Labour candidate. So like you say, Bristol was quite early for Trades Council. They were early for Labour representation. And they're also early for really challenging the Liberal. There was a clear Liberal-Labour split in Bristol early on, right through. And it was seen as quite odd in that respect, because there were all these Liberal Labour alliances in other places. Even in a lot of the places I look at, Leicester, Northampton, there was very much this clear Lib-Lab kind of alliance going on, whereas in Bristol they would have nothing to do. And I wonder if, like you're saying, it was because maybe the Liberals were seen as representing this merchant class that you're talking about. Maybe, I'm just thinking out loud now, maybe that idea that the Conservatives were the aristocracy and Liberals were the middle class, maybe they felt that actually we resolved that old issue between aristocrats and the people. Now we need to have this more working class or capital Labour challenge. Yeah, that's a really interesting viewpoint. Yeah, thank you.
I do always feel that our speakers get as much from the participants as the participants do from the speaker. It's we have a good trade-off. Okay, is there anybody else who wants to wave at me? I will have a quick look onto page 2 of you. Anybody? No, I think we may have, satiated people's curiosity for today. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. That's yeah, as you see, we have a very engaged audience here, and they like me. Have very much enjoyed hearing you and your topic. And we're sorry that your book got launched during lockdown, but we do still wish you all the very best with it. It's Manchester University Press, folks. So yes, if you want to save up for it, then
I need to save up for it.
So, okay, we say thank you very much indeed to Matthew. Now, next week, that's Wednesday, the 24th of February, at the same time, we'll be welcoming another Matthew Roberts, to speak on the topic Politics and the Memory of Chartism in England and Wales, 1918 to 20. And as my colleague Jane has just put in the chat, this talk has been recorded too and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and the link is there in the chat. And a final reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there is a donate button on our website. Thanks again, and goodbye until the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity. Best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you.